right, welcome back everybody for our second part in our RCT series with Julie Hoyer and Tim Wilson. Today they're going to talk to us on the TLC about covariate considerations in your RCT planning to block before or regress afterwards. And in case you didn't get the intro last week, Tim Wilson has been so gracious to shorten it for us a little bit. And if anybody doesn't know search discovery and Tim Wilson, that's you got lots of learning to do. Catch up. He is let's just read this for a second because I find it actually quite enjoyable. He does have a ridiculous hairstyle, but we love it and we love him. You should go check out, what was the hashtag? Tim Wilson's hair. Great hashtag. Fantastic. And of course, the co-host on the Analytics Hour podcast. He does hold strong opinions about how much time should be spent on speaker bios when there's real content to get to. And that was his little nudge to get me to not spend too much time introducing them. But we have to spend some time with Julie. Julie is a senior analyst with us at Search Discovery, and she holds no strong opinions about how long we should spend on her bio. So maybe we should just spend a little bit more time here, Tim, talking about Julie and her background. No, not quite so much.
Move it along.
But there's a bunch for us to cover, so I'm going to pass it over to you guys and let you take it away. Thanks, guys.
Well, thanks.
Awesome.
Go for it, Tim.
So yeah, I'm doing like 3 minutes and then it's going to be the Julie show. So our witty title, RCTs and the covariate considerations therein. We're going to start, if we go to the next slide, with just a quick refresher from the last session. I don't know how many people made the last one, but the first session was really about RCTs. So just because the terminology we will be using it, we will be referring to RCTs, randomized controlled trials, go under lots of different names, and we were clear that A/B testing is one form of an RCT. It's kind of a particular form we're going to focus on a little bit less today. If we go to the next slide, just hitting some of them. Clinical trials, the common theme with RCTs is that no matter what name they are under, a field trial, a field experiment, an A/B test, randomization is super, super key. So we talked a degree about randomization on the last one. We're going to talk about randomization today a little bit as well. But also what we're talking about today is when you hear that a trial was run and, oh, we controlled for height, or we controlled for age, or we controlled for weight. That controlled for is generally referring to covariates. And so that's what we're going to kind of dive in a little bit more deeply today. If we go to the next slide, A/B tests, as we said, they're a form of RCT. Typically, we have much higher volume, more subjects. So some of the techniques, or the techniques we're going to talk about today, a lot of times they're more valuable and impactful when we have a smaller number of subjects. But A/B test, another form of RCT. Next slide. But mainly kind of the focus is, or where we have kind of found ourselves getting deeper into the topics for today, is kind of around doing kind of media impact with RCTs. The RCTs apply in many different ways, but what happens when, where we got ourselves into is if we're randomizing on something like DMA, we only have, a couple hundred subjects as opposed to, several thousand. And that's where covariates can be kind of a good way to add some additional information that we can use to kind of decrease our sampling variability. I think with that, I will hand it over to Julie for new content.
Cool. Thanks, Tim. Yep. So today we're going to dig into some of the details that Tim just brought up about those covariates. So we're going to start with some key terminology that we kind of want to get a foundation with everybody on, since we'll be mentioning them later. We're going to walk through again, the magic of randomization, but kind of where we run into limitations and where we would actually want to start considering, controlling for covariates. And then when we decide, we want to control for these covariates, what are 2 ways that you can do that? And we'll walk through both of those ways. So first, let's talk about those fancy, fun words. The first word here is potential outcomes. So I like to think of potential outcomes kind of like, I don't know, that sci-fi, maybe it's a theory, maybe it's just in a couple sci-fi movies, but every time you make a decision in life, it's like another reality splits off as if you had made the other decision, but you can only ever live one. So that's how I think of potential outcomes. Is there is a subject and there are 2 possible things that happen. Either the subject doesn't get treated and you would see a potential outcome here of $523. Maybe that's what they spent. And just a quick call out on the notation as we walk through. Y stands for outcome. Y sub 0 stands for they did not get treated. That sub 0 is kind of like a flag of did not receive treatment. So this subject, let's say if they were to be treated, they'd have an outcome of $523. And this is kind of like hypothetical. We're still talking here. And then hypothetically, if they were treated, we're saying that their potential treated outcome, or Y sub 1, would be they spent $587. But the trick with potential outcomes, of course, is that you can only ever see one at a time. We can never observe both of these things. So really, it's just hypothetical that we could tie both of those outcomes to that subject. So what random assignment helps us do is it determines for each subject which potential outcome we're actually going to be able to observe. And then the other potential outcome that we cannot observe, so what they were not assigned, becomes what we call a counterfactual. It's like the hypothetical thing we did not get to see. And so here, as an example, again, if this specific subject was randomly assigned to treatment, then what we would observe is that Y sub 1 as our outcome. So it would be the treated potential outcome is observed of $587. And now that potential untreated outcome of Y sub 0 is our unobserved counterfactual. On the other hand, if a subject was randomly assigned to not be treated or to control, then the potential untreated outcome of $523 would be our observed outcome for them. And now that Y sub 1 or the potential treated outcome of $587 is our unobserved counterfactual. So with that, we're actually going to jump into a beautiful simulator that we have made, which I'm really excited about, and show you how when we build a data set here, we can actually hypothetically see the whole schedule of potential outcomes. So we'll start with a large one, why not? So if we create this data set, you can see down here in the table that every single subject, and what happens is we have 3,200, has a full schedule of if they were not treated, what their outcome would be, and if they were treated, what the outcome would be. The other thing in this simulator to call out is that we have given you the ability to set the actual true treatment effect. So as if you were an all-knowing being and you actually knew exactly what the real treatment effect was. Right now it's set to 15. And when we created,
can you zoom in a little bit? Can you zoom in on that a little bit?
Maybe. Hang on. Zoom. Did it work? Command plus.
Yeah.
Command plus should do it.
And plus.
Uh-huh. Is that better?
Keep going. Keep going. A little bit more. You just have a really, really high.
You see it now?
There you go. Perfect.
There you go.
Probably giant for you, but it's great for us.
Yeah. Yes, it is on my big screen. Good call. Thank you. So we've set it to be a large set or sample. And so that's 3,200 observations. We set our true treatment effect to 15%. And when we ran this, really what we're seeing is 14.9, because of course we've generated randomness within the data. And when we scroll down to actually look at the data set we built, you can see every single subject has that potential untreated outcome and potential treated outcome to estimate an effect for each subject. Again, this is hypothetical. We would never actually be able to observe both of these values for each subject. So then going back to the deck here, we'll talk about two other really important terms. So the next one being covariates. I mean, it is, in the title, it's pretty important. So the definition of a covariate is really just that these are other characteristics about our subjects. They aren't necessarily a part, they are not part of the treatment. They're not part of the treatment assignment. They are just characteristics of our subjects that could predict the outcome or our dependent variable. And I want to call out that predict here is a very important term because we stay agnostic whether these covariates actually affect our outcome, we're only talking about that they have a relationship and seem to predict outcome. So thinking correlation instead of causation here. And another key about covariates is that they cannot be affected by treatment assignment in the RCT. So our intervention of treatment cannot affect these, and whether they fall in treatment and control, like these should not be tied together. Treatment assignment should always be independent of all these other characteristics, other than them receiving treatment. The other thing about covariates, well, I guess actually some examples of covariates are if we were testing the efficacy of a diet pill, you know, what is their future weight loss going to be, is probably pretty related to their current BMI. So current BMI would be thought of as a covariate for future weight loss. A couple other examples here would be, you know, looking at past store sales as a covariate for future store sales. Maybe some stores don't sell a lot right now. Some stores already sell a ton. So those may not be great starting points for our comparison of treatment. So those are different characteristics that we may need to take into consideration. And so now moving on to the last term we're going to talk about before jumping into the rest of the content is heterogeneity. You may be thinking, oh, isn't that when, you know, really smart statistical people get on and they talk about those fancy scatter plots that don't follow a pattern? Actually, no, that's not heterogeneity. Luckily, that is something more complex called heteroskedasticity. And even though it's fun to say, we're not going to talk about it really today. But a quick overview, it would be more so the scatter plot is used to show that there's unequal variability in one variable across the range of another variable that we believe to predict it. So just a little tidbit there, but we're going to leave it at that. Heterogeneity is actually in its simplest terms, meaning not the same. So it's the opposite of homogeneous. So if we're looking at these squares, we would say, you know, the color of these blocks are heterogeneous. There's heterogeneity in the color. So when it comes to A/B testing or RCTs and things like that, we are going to run into heterogeneity in some of these other variables or these covariates. In A/B testing, you could think about how across our sample, you know, there's going to be heterogeneity in the browser or the operating system, the marketing channel that they maybe came from, or even the device type. And of course, there's many, many other things that are going to have heterogeneity. Ooh. Okay, so heterogeneity there are three types we usually talk about. So the first one would be unobserved heterogeneity. These are things that you can't really measure or know. So maybe something obscure like brand preference. It's very like abstract. So we really can't observe those about all of our subjects. The next one would be observable at the time of random assignment. So you could think of this as like pre-test data, things and characteristics we can measure and understand about our subjects before the intervention of the experiment. So these would be great things to use in our actual design of our test. So hint, hint, we're going to talk about that shortly with one of the covariate controlling methods. The third one is actually observable heterogeneity, but in a characteristic that we actually like couldn't measure or didn't know about until after we did our random assignment or did our like intervention of our test. And so these ones are a lot trickier because we still may need to account for them, but there are definitely some guidelines around accounting for them, which we'll get into. So we know random assignment, we talked about it last time, it's very magical with heterogeneity, right? It's going to help kind of account for all this crazy variation that we can either observe or not observe. But one of the greatest things about random assignment and its ability to balance heterogeneity is the fact that when we tie all three words that we've just talked about back together, is that whole idea comes back to potential outcomes. We need to run a test on this subject and we need to see both of its potential outcomes. So we know that can't happen with actually one individual, but when we look at a larger group of people and randomly assign them to two groups, the idea is to make like an identical twin of the subject in aggregate. And so what that gives us is a kind of this even baseline to then give one group treatment and one group keep them as control. And when we get their outcomes, we can compare them as if we got to see both potential outcomes and see the difference. And then we can actually get an estimate of what our treatment caused. So to talk a little bit more through this, we're going to jump back into that simulator. And now we're actually going to look at the fact that you can see that every single subject has been assigned a color. And we are going to use color as a representation of a covariate. It could be religion, it could be mean income, it could really be anything we want, but we're going to use color here to represent that. And if we look at this scatter plot of our 3,200 subjects, we see that there is definitely heterogeneity in this characteristic. And so if we were to run a simulation of our experiment over here, what you'll see is when they randomly get assigned a control and treatment, the colors are broken up between the two groups pretty evenly, right? We have a large population. We have law of large numbers on our side, and they look pretty good. And when we actually take this aggregate average color of each group, though we can see a difference in the numbers here, visually to us, that's a pretty even group. They're pretty identical to go run a test on for this covariate. Now, what's interesting is if we go back to our data set, and let's take this down to a much smaller size and create a new data set. Now what we'll see, and we only have 242 observations now, so much smaller. If we were to run a simulation here, what happens is eventually we may run into where these are slightly different. We can't really see it right now. It's not too bad, but let's say that we're running something on DMAs, right? Like we just mentioned, or Tim mentioned, and let's take this down to an even smaller group. Why not? Let's take it to the smallest it goes. And what happens is now when we try to go and do randomization, you'll see that these starting groups are very different. So these would not be easy to go measure potential outcomes and say, yeah, we got a really accurate read on treatment effect. So what happens with those covariates and relying on the magic of randomization? Do we just always rely on randomization? Not exactly. Sometimes we can't get bigger subject groups, right? So we can't just rely on randomization because we might get that rare one that gives us really unbalanced starting groups. So what we are going to talk through today is actually looking at covariates at two different stages in this timeline of a test. They can be taken advantage of in the beginning when you're designing it, or they can be taken into consideration at the end for your analysis. So let's start with the first one. Actually, conceptually, in both spots, we will be able to reduce sampling variability of our observed effect. So you'll see at the top here, you have a sampling variability, kind of the range, the distribution of estimated average treatment effects you may observe with one experiment will fall in that range centered around the actual treatment effect. And so you can see it's much more spread out there than if we were to look at incorporating covariates in the bottom two graphs. One you'll see gets way tighter on sampling variability if we have a covariate that strongly predicts our outcome. And even if our covariate weakly predicts our outcome, it's still tighter than that just complete randomization sampling distribution we see at the top. So now to talk about the first one, block randomization. So first thing we want to talk about, and we've definitely had people thrown off by that term, blocking doesn't mean like stopping something or keeping someone out. Blocking simply means creating groups of subjects based on like the different covariate values that we have, pretty much. So think of grouping, not stopping. And so really here, blocking is going to help us balance that heterogeneity we see in certain covariates across groups, and groups as in assignment groups. So in this top row here, this is complete randomization. Here's our control group, here's our treatment group. And you can see that across each color, you know, it's not the exact count. They're slightly differing. And what would happen is if we ran the test like this, then we would just look at the average treatment effect calculated across all the observations. Pretty straightforward. But if we were to use blocking, what happens is we group all of the subjects that were light yellow, all the subjects that were orange, that were blue, teal, purple, red into their own color blocks. And then what we do is do complete randomization on each color block so that 50% of the subjects in yellow end up in control and end up in treatment and so forth down this list of colors. So now you can see that the counts are almost exact. And what happens, and I say almost only because there were odd numbers, it is a 50-50 split. And then with blocking, what happens is you actually calculate the average treatment effect for each color group across treatment and control. It's like you now have mini experiments running for each color. And then based on the size of the blocks, you would then do a weighted calculation to get the overall average treatment effect of your full experiment. All right. So now let's actually look at blocking in action in our beautiful simulator here. So let's start with this tiny group that we ran, and we see that these are very uneven. So if I now decide to actually block on color and run my simulation, you can see that these are much, much closer. Now we're at 50. So these are not the exact aggregate color, but they're way closer than they were. And this count is much closer to being equal. If we were to go back actually, and say, this was a weakly predictive covariate, bring it up a little bit. And let's say that we wanna look at strongly predictive. We create the data set. We're gonna simulate our experiment here. Nice even brown color across the board. Our blocks look good down here. And then if I actually go to simulate, we're going to see 500 iterations of this experiment. We'll actually get to look at the sampling distribution of this experiment. And it's going to compare the blocked version compared to the complete randomization version. And so you can see here that these two standard deviation lines differ for the completely randomized group and the blocked group. And it's tighter here in the blocked group, because if we go back and actually look at our data set as well, we can see that we chose it to be strongly predictive. Now, if I were to run this again and actually do no predictiveness of our covariate of color, rerun this, should be able to, I think I can just run this. We'll see that blocking didn't hurt our sampling distribution, but it didn't better it compared to complete randomization.
It's going to be a new word I'm going to use. Did you better it? Hashtag better it.
Better
it. You're welcome.
But you can see these look almost exactly the same. This is slightly off by 0.1%. But you can see that blocking didn't really hurt it, but it can help it based on how predictive your covariate is of your outcome. Okay, so now, in summary, when is blocking best utilized then? So obviously, like we kind of just walked through, it's best to utilize it if you know a covariate is predictive of your outcome, because you want it to reduce your sampling variability. You want to make your estimation more precise with the knowledge you have of this covariate. The other thing is if your sample size is small, kind of like we showed, it's going to be a lot harder to get those even starting groups to then measure the effect of your treatment. So blocking can help you get those even groups. The other thing is some like soft skills I like to say about blocking is it helps be very transparent in your design about your prior beliefs of what's going on. Maybe there's been research that showed that this covariate was predictive of your outcome. So let's take it into consideration and let's put it in our design. Another great thing is that it actually gives a very clear template then of how you would analyze this test as well. Because like I said, you have to do some very specific calculations around the blocks you design. And so when you say this is what we blocked on and these are the groups we have, you know that you have to analyze by those same blocks. And the final thing that's really helpful about blocking, it's soft skills, is that you don't get to an end of a test, run your analysis on just the completely randomized group and get one result and then say, oh, we need to also take a covariate into consideration. And now you have a new result. And so interpreting the difference between those two results can start to get kind of tricky, especially depending on how complex the situation is or what you controlled for. So it is kind of nice that you start off with your like adjusted result. And so you don't get that weird, like, well, you started with this result and now you have a adjusted one. Now, blocking, though it is powerful and helpful, sometimes it's just not as impactful. And maybe it's not worth the added, work around it. So if you have a large sample, kind of like we showed in the simulator, you have the law of large numbers on your side, much more likely that heterogeneity is going to balance out between your two groups. The other time is if you don't actually need those mini experiments to be run, if you don't need results at that block level, and you don't know if the covariate's really predictive, maybe you don't need to do blocking. And then the last one is when kind of goes along the same lines that I was just discussing, but if your covariate's not super predictive of outcome, then when you break it up into your different blocks, their potential outcomes, like starting points, are probably not that difference between blocks. And so that means that you might not get much benefit from using blocking. Like you won't get as much increased precision as you may hope.
So there are a couple of questions that this might be a good time to ask and answer them. So how do we know if covariates will be weak or strong or non-predictive? In the follow-up, how do we make sure covariates are predictive? Then there's like a Bayes and Pryor's question, but we can, table that maybe.
Oh, I appreciate that one. Yeah, I think some of the time it's, to be honest, maybe a hunch, maybe it's knowing that it's a baseline. So like some of our examples that we had, current sales in an area, and you're looking at impact on sales. I mean, that's probably like intuitively a good thing to block on or control for. Now, if it's, I don't know, height or something like that, and maybe there was research done in the field that says height is correlated to the outcome you're looking at, then maybe you would want to block on it. I don't know if that's super straightforward, and sometimes you might not know ahead of time to block. It may be that you ran a test, you realized it was a covariate that was predictive, and then in your next iteration, you control for it in blocking. But Tim, what would you say?
I think that's good. I think there are times where you just know from the historical, taking your outcome, taking your covariate, and just look at the historical data and say, are they very different? Historically would be an indicator. And then I think we got a little cavalier with this when we were starting it, but it still holds true that by including a covariate, if you think it might, you're not going, that last little simulation that you showed, you're not going to make things worse. You're adding complexity, and that can be complexity in the assignment and the execution, but you're not going to, you could completely add just the silliest covariate possible, and it should not negatively impact your results. You're just adding complexity to the design, execution, and analysis.
Right. Yes. And that's a very good point that I did not call out clearly enough. The idea is you could throw in, any covariate, even if it's not predictive, it won't hurt your sampling variability. At best, it will improve it to some degree. The degree to which it betters it would be on how predictive the covariate is of your outcome.
All right.
It definitely can introduce the cost from a complexity of
right. There's always a cost associated with the greater information that you want to put in there. There's two more questions, Tim, and I wanted to see if this is the right time to ask them or if you want to save them for. You see the question from Channing and Matt.
Yeah. Isn't this like using priors in Bayes? I am not equipped to
No,
answer.
that's not the question. Is there something special we need to do with calculating our variance of the treatment effect?
So that, I think that's where did you hear the question or see the question, Julie? I think
I'm trying to pull it up.
So it's, I think my understanding and what is like, that's sort of where you can calculate the variability, similar to as you would with doing just a traditional A/B test, but there's also the sharp null hypothesis, and I may be getting way out over my skis, where you kind of assume no effect and you can use that to actually estimate get a pretty good estimate of the variability. I mean,
yeah,
backing up, like where I had historically gotten lost, like we're running simulations, we're being omnipotent, we're seeing the sampling variability. Obviously, that's just telling us when we guess, how far do we think we are from the mean. So the key to all of this is actually being able to estimate what that variability is, even if we don't know where in that variability we fall.
Right. Yeah, I think it comes back to creating the full schedule of the potential outcomes. The assumption using the sharp null hypothesis is that no subject has any effect from treatment. And so it's like, once you estimate your treatment effect, then you actually use that value to fill in your potential outcomes. If they were treated, you back up that much to get, if they weren't treated, you use that percent to go forward to if they had been treated. And then you can run this simulation, which we did, is like you randomly reassign to treatment and control, and you have the full schedule now. And then it gives you the sampling variability or the sampling distribution after like 500 iterations of what the ATE was that you would have observed by mixing up your assignments. If that helps.
He's typing.
He's still typing, but
yeah,
while he's typing, did you see regression?
Did you see? He says he's good. Did you see Channing's question? Is it possible for something like Simpson's paradox to occur when blocking like this, where a clear result in one block is obscured by results in other blocks?
Where is that question?
It's in the TLC.
Oh, in the TLC. Sorry, I have so many windows open.
There. Okay. Oh, Simpson's paradox. That's a good question.
Yeah, that is. I mean, definitely you can get different results in different blocks. So in aggregate, yeah, you would see if one was really flat, one was great, or one was negative, one was positive. Is that kind of what we're thinking when you bring them together?
Would almost say you'd get like a negative effect in all of them, but a positive overall. And it's going to make my brain melt, but I'm thinking of Simpson's paradox of being like where you've got your groups are kind of correlated. I think that's an excellent question. That
it is.
I don't think so, because you're still looking at treatment groups, and because you're weighting them, I guess that's the other thing, is you're weighting based on the volume.
And you don't just look at the overall, right? You look at the blocks, right?
Yeah.
But Simpson's paradox would say you'd see negative effects in most of the blocks and yet a positive effect overall.
Yeah, I don't think you could.
Because you weight. I think because you do the weighted.
Mm-hmm.
I think. I love that question though.
Yeah, we may have to look further into that, but I agree with you.
Kenny thinks you made a good point about the weighting, that might control for it.
Mm-hmm.
And Matt also says SP, which I assume he means Simpson's paradox, would be more likely if you don't have balanced blocks.
Mm.
But again, you're weighting.
Yeah. And we kind of touched on some of this, like the consequences of blocking already, of like the cost of complexity and adding it in. Also, if you ever wanted to do multiple covariates, you would have to like combine the 2 or 3 variables you're trying to block on into, all the combinations or some type of single representation of it to get your block. So that can be tricky. But definitely we've done blocking based on like demographics for DMAs, where you take a lot into consideration. So there are also R packages that help with this stuff, I think, which makes it a little easier. And then the last thing is, like we just talked about, you have to take into consideration the size of each block to weight each individual result to get the overall. And if for some reason, if you really had a crazy design with blocks and you had different probability for treatment assignment in each block, you would have to take that into consideration in your equation as well. I think that's a little less common, but either way, if you were to do blocking, you go to your analysis and you don't properly account for the blocks that you created, you can have very severely biased results. So that's one call out. Like, you design for it, you have to include it in the analysis. So now you think, well, what if I didn't block? Like, what am I supposed to do? I can't go back. I don't want to redesign my whole test. Well, the good news is that you can still control for covariates in your analysis using regression adjustment. So I want to first go back to this and talk about, we talked about pre-test running, and now we want to talk about post-test. And we're actually going to go through regression a little more specifically. So to start, when we run an RCT, we're trying to understand the relationship between our dependent variable and our treatment, or if it was assigned to treatment. And so how we can do that with regression is actually to regress our outcome data on our assignment. And so I know this looks really mathy and heavy, but I'm going to try and walk through it and just ignore the symbols to a point. Like, we're just going to talk about these beautiful color blocks. But this is the equation where you're regressing outcomes in terms of like potential outcomes on treatment assignment. So really quickly, to run through just this little legend, M is going to represent mean. We have the outcome of a subject that was not treated. So the untreated potential outcome of a subject. And then Y sub I of 1 would be the treated potential outcome of a subject. And then D sub I is the treatment assignment for some subject I. So when we look at this equation, first starting with like this first constant, it's really just saying the intercept, or like if no treatment was ever done, we didn't treat anybody, then the intercept of this outcome would just be the mean untreated outcome of everybody. And then this next colored block here, you can see it is in terms of treatment assignment, which makes sense, but it's actually our ATE, because it's saying what is the difference between the mean of the treated outcomes and the mean of the untreated outcomes. And then this big gray block is what they call the disturbance term. And it looks really gross and ugly, but what it does is, depending on the value of DI, 0 or 1, 0 for control, 1 for treatment, this simply ends up representing the variance between untreated responses and the mean untreated response, or the variation between a treated response and the mean untreated response. So really just think of it as an error term. This is just representing unexplainable variation. And so when we kind of make it nice and small, what ends up happening is regression is going to help us solve for these three coefficients. Really, the ones we care about are the intercept and the average treatment effect. And what's really cool is that when you use ordinary least squares regression, this B value, or ATE, actually comes out as the exact same result as a simple difference in means estimator, which I think we're more comfortable with, like with A/B tests and whatnot. So my mind was blown when I realized you could use regression to just get the same result. Like, it took me forever to understand how it worked. I'm starting to understand it more. But what happens is, in least squares, they end up trying to minimize the residuals, which means they solve for A and B by moving these two terms to the left-hand side of the equation, and they run all these values of A and B until they can minimize the error term, pretty much. And so now that we kind of basically have an idea of like regression and how we get our result from it, now we want to talk about how do you actually add in these adjustments to it if we have a covariate that we want to take into consideration in our results. So going back to, this was our simple equation to start, these pieces here. What we end up doing is adding 0 to our equation, which again is like, I love math. This seems like magic to me. I think it's so cool that you can do this. But really why we can do this is if we remember two facts about covariates. One, they are not related to assignment, right? So we don't need to put them in terms of DI, which would kind of completely change the equation and what we're solving for. And the other one is they don't affect outcome. So when we get results for this new term added in, like it's not a causal result that we're reading out. Really, these are put in to help as an adjustment for solving for B still. So what you do is you add in the term where X sub I here is going to represent our covariate for each subject. So maybe it's the color of each subject is what this represents. And C is our coefficient that the regression is going to be able to take into consideration and solve for. And since we added it and we want to really just add 0 to our equation, we have to subtract it as well. So we add it and we subtract it. You'll notice that we subtract it from that error term we talked about. So what it does is, like I said, it's now able to take this term into consideration when the regression solves for our coefficients. And the other thing it does is it reduces the standard error of B because we are actually reducing this error term of UI, or the unexplained variation. We've now, because whatever value UI is, now we're subtracting something from it, so it's less. And so here's kind of the cleaned up version of this is what the residual definition would be. So you can see we just moved these 3 terms from the right-hand side of the equation to the left by subtracting them. And now U sub I star is just like that adjusted UI. I just wrapped that subtraction of our new term into this one new variable. And so now what happens is you do your regression, it tries to minimize this value of U sub I star, and you end up with these 3 values, and now B, your ATE, is adjusted. It's a new value. Any questions coming through before I do this?
The only question that I got added was, can I block and use post-analysis regression, or is that overkill?
No, you can. We've like blocked on DMAs before, so they've been assigned a block, or we've blocked on state before, and then we accounted for another controlled variable. So technically, like you can't just, there isn't a limitation that you can only add 1. I'm not saying add 20, like, you know, you start to go into another mathematical theory of like over adjusting or whatever, but you technically could have 2 terms in your regression. And again, it looks much simpler in R. I would add in like, take in my blocking information as a factor. Oh, and take in this other covariate I think needs to be controlled for. So you could have 2.
So you could potentially block on something that you have strong evidence will be a strong predictor. And then once you're looking at your results, could you say, oh, there was an unexpected covariate and we want to add that in there as a regression? Or would you run the regression to find the covariate?
I don't think you want to. One thing I will say is you don't want to like run a million regressions with a bunch of different combinations, because then that's when you really start to run into like injecting your own bias of like which result you prefer. I mean, it's hard not to do that, right? Like you start to see all the possibles and you're like, oh, well, that one has a much nicer story. Sometimes logically you could, you know, deduce between 2 or 3, you check which one's the real story. But yeah, I would say it's best to put in what you believe to be true and kind of go with it, and go based on like the format of the results you're going to get. Would be, at least from my somewhat short experience, like actually being the one getting in there and analyzing these and talking to other people, I would say, think of the end story and what you need to read out and design the regression based on that.
Like it.
Any other ones?
Not yet.
Okay.
I'll let you know.
Cool. So really now, 2 critical notes about using regression with your RCTs. Again, we talked about this, but if you used blocking or design, you have to add it into your regression because the regression has to be able to take those designations into account when reading everything out. And in R, I keep going back to R because that's where we've run the regressions, but you are able to, in your regression, like add in a term to calculate the block weight as well. So you would add in like plus state if that's what you're blocking on, and then you would designate your calculated weight for each block in the code. And then the other thing about using regression in RCTs is, remember, we cannot add in variables that are affected by treatment assignment as a covariate. Covariates need to be this like consistent characteristic about your subject that it's like independent of treatment assignment, and it wasn't an outcome from treatment assignment or your treatment. So really the rule of thumb is you should be trying to use like pre-test data as your covariates. Now, the only time that you could maybe step away from that idea is if you saw a covariate from whatever you could measure during your test, right? Maybe you just don't have any pre-test data. And if you are 100% sure this covariate did not change from pre-test to post-test, like my height or something, like if it was subject height, you could probably use it as a covariate. But again, if you're talking about kids, you know, you probably can't. It might have changed. I don't know what your intervention is. So you can see where you get into this sticky situation of, if I can only measure it after my treatment assignment, how confident can I be that it was not changed because of my treatment? So that's where rule of thumb is, like, you really want to use like pre-test data as your covariates and be sure that it's like a consistent schedule of that characteristic. And so here is kind of like a summary of the difference between the two techniques of, you know, taking covariates into consideration in your analysis. But I think the biggest call out is both of these can help increase precision of your estimate of your average treatment effect. And it does that by decreasing sampling variability. If we compare it, of course, to just doing complete randomization. The other call out I'll make is, if you were to run a test and block on a covariate and then run the test in another sample and just control for that covariate, technically blocking will get you more precision than controlling for it in regression. You get slightly more precision with blocking in compared to controlling for them in the regression, but both would improve it from complete randomization. And so this is a quote that I love from a book me and Tim have been reading a lot, but really it's the balance of, you know, using covariates to your benefit, but not falling into the trap of introducing more bias. And that book, of course, is Field Experiments, which is a great book if you want to learn more about this and read a lot of dense chapters, but I do think it's written really well. So always a plug for our favorite book. And I will end there. Any questions?
You're welcome, Matt.
Him or I. Oh, and there's the bit.ly for the simulator, which is actually really fun to go and play with and use to explain randomization and blocking.
I took a stab at summarizing your answers to some of the questions that were actually posted in the TLC calls channel. Will each of you take a peek after the call and make sure that I didn't butcher what you would have said, and feel free to answer any that I skipped.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Kelly.
Exactly, Matt. We worked hard to find a flattering pick.
I didn't do that, by the way. Just putting that out there.
Nobody is surprised by this. Anybody have any other questions? I know go ahead, Tim.
I was going to say the simulator, I mean, I think as we were working on this, it kind of came into sort of two parts. One, like being able to have the, it really is kind of, or I've certainly found it being pretty illustrative to play around with the weakly versus strong, even doing kind of a zero effect test and looking what happens when you have a, you know, basically an AA test with this. And a lot of it winds up equating right into just the core of what we need to understand when doing A/B testing, but getting down to those smaller blocks. So that's up and will be up indefinitely. So if anyone plays around or finds anything that doesn't make sense, let us know.
I know that this is very dense content, especially throwing in the formulas and all of that. So if you guys need time to chew on it and rewatch it, you can always reach back out on the TLC to both Julie and Tim, and they will either answer your question or try to tag somebody who can. I am curious though, if anybody's willing to share, did you find this information helpful? Is it intriguing? Does it make you ask yourself why you haven't been, blocking or using regressions to control covariates before? Or are you already doing this? Is this, common practice for you? Matt asked, did I understand that blocking requires the use of regression ANOVA for the analysis?
I don't think it requires ANOVA. I think just the regression.
And technically you could, am I right? You get, if with just a simple weighted average, you could get just the average treatment effect, but the regression kind of gives you just more information beyond that, right? I mean, technically you could get but you would just have the average treatment effect. You would have nothing around any sort of degree of confidence or anything. Is that not right?
Well, when you add in into the regression and you add in that control for your blocked information, it does read out information on each block, but I will say it's going to choose an intercept. So it can be kind of weird. If you're doing states and it chooses Alaska as the intercept, so now I see it and compared to Alaska and it gets kind of funky. So if you want to read out your results for each block, I would almost say just go do it a little more manual for that block. Because I have had trouble, the way the results spit out for the regression for getting the individual block result can be weird. If you want the overall average treatment effect with blocks considered, put it in the regression, run the regression, and you get your result for treatment.
And Lizzie asked, is there a rule of thumb for the best number of blocks to use? Is there such a thing as too many? And then Matt Polycoster adds, yeah, I think it'd be along the lines of multiple comparison adjustments if you had a lot of for each block.
I think, Tim, and I've kind of wondered this actually, when you're designing a test and looking at the power analysis, making sure that each block is somewhat powered, although you can do it on a small sample. So I don't, technically in the book, they talk about you could do a paired sample block.
Well, that's really how, when we've done the DMAs, right? We've done, we've blocked on, yeah, it's a paired sample basically. And it's the same idea. So sometimes I think it's based on the kind of the levels of your covariate, because you are going to need to split it into groups. So paired is 1-to-1 or 1-1-1 if it's, for their three, depending on how the design. Mm-hmm. But I could see that if you get down too small, if you're in some kind of weird hybrid ground of where you're blocks that have 5 in each one. So you're going to have 3 and 2. Mm-hmm. But
all right. Well, we have 2 minutes left. If anybody has a final question, feel free to ask it. But in the meantime, I want to let everybody know that our next conversation is tentatively scheduled for November 19th. And we're going to talk about redirects. Several questions have come up on the TLC recently about, issues that people are seeing when they're running redirects. So we're going to try to bring in somebody who can speak from an SEO perspective, from an analytics perspective, and from an experimentation design perspective, and the dev side as well, of all the implications and things to look out for and the pitfalls and whatnot. But we'll let Matt here have the last word. Won't you be happy, sir? He says, I would think the multiple rerunning of the regressions looking for different covariates would be when you would be in multiple comparisons or overfitting land, so, as opposed to having multiple blocks, multiple running of the regression, if I understood him correctly. But both Lizzie and Matt say great session. So thanks, guys. Really appreciate you.
Yeah, thanks for having us on, letting us talk about math.
I know, and it's not easy to take such a complex subject and make it something that actually makes sense. So great job. Really appreciate you guys. Thank you. Bye, y'all.
Bye.